Welcome to Cuba, a communist-run northern Caribbean island which has been stuck in a time warp for 50 years. It has a rich mixture of European and African cultures, white sandy beaches, architecture, music, dance, food, and old cars. Back in the 1920s, Havana hosted more tourists than any other location in the Caribbean, and it was the country's third largest source of foreign currency, behind the two dominant industries of sugar and tobacco. Faced with financial ruin following the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, tourism was seen as an opportunity to earn foreign currency. In the early days, there were restrictions. Visitors were limited to enclave resorts, segregated from Cuban society. But things have moved on, and today there are millions of visitors to the island. However, most still frequent the westernized resorts such as Veradero, Cayo Coco, and the beach areas of Holguin, where there are good hotels offering many activities. Some tourists will visit Havana on a day trip, but few tourists visit the rest of the island. Havana was founded in the 16th century and grew from an obscure port into a bustling hub when gold and silver were being pillaged by the Spanish in the 16th century. It replaced Santiago de Cuba as the island's most important city. In more recent times, we have seen the American-backed dictator Batista being overthrown during the Cuban Revolution in 1959. The Malecon is a broad esplanade, roadway and seawall which stretches for 8 kilometers along the Caribbean coast. Its main purpose is to protect Havana from the sea. Its construction began in 1901 during temporary US military rule and continued in 2 more phases, eventually being completed in 1952. The Malecon continues to be popular among Cubans, especially among those of lesser means whose entertainment options are limited. It is also a means of income for poorer families as individual fishermen cast their lures. High tides bring the waves crashing onto the concrete wall, but the locals know exactly where to stand in order to avoid a soaking. Well, maybe not everyone. It's probably the most famous and iconic seaside promenade in Cuba, where people come to relax and maybe fantasize and gaze at the horizon, trying to see the lights of Florida, just 90 miles away. And of course, classic cars from the 1950s, Buicks, Chryslers, Oldsmobiles and Chevrolets still cruise by. The Malecon remains one of the most spectacular and popular destinations in Havana, providing one of the best locations to watch the sun setting over the island. At night it becomes a local meeting area. People listen to music or chat about sports or dance. Local musicians supplement their earnings by singing or dancing for you. Havana's old city is very well preserved, and UNESCO designated it a World Heritage Site in 1982. The streets are lined with colonial architecture, 16th century fortresses and many churches. Inside the Cathedral de San Cristobal it's simple, almost to the point of austerity, thanks to a radical 19th century neoclassical makeover. All of these factors make it a great location for the film industry. There are many grand buildings such as the University, National Ballet School, and the Grand Theatre, which is currently undergoing restoration. The El Capitolio building, which was completed in 1929, is often compared to that of the United States Capitol building, but it's not a replica. It was the seat of government until the Revolution, after which it fell into disrepair. The building is currently under renovation for use once again as the home of Cuba's National Assembly. And then there is the American Embassy, which closed in 1961, when President Eisenhower severed US relations with Cuba. There are many tree-lined avenues, magnificent hotels such as the Telegraph, Inglaterra and Nacional, where in 1933 a battle between army officers and soldiers took place following Batista's proclamation that he is the new Army Chief of Staff. The Plaza de Armas features a statue of Manuel de Cespedes, the man who set Cuba on the road to independence. It's the oldest plaza and is surrounded by restaurants, numerous second-hand book stands and shops selling cigars and rum. A Floridita bartender is credited with inventing the frozen daiquiri in the 1930s, a drink that later became linked to the fame of the establishment. While the Nobel Prize-winning American writer Ernest Hemingway frequented the bar, which was a short walk from the hotel Ambos Mundos, where Hemingway maintained a room on the 5th floor and penned several short stories between 1932 and 1939. Part of Cuba's charm for tourists is due to the economic embargo imposed by the United States. Castro's Cuba has become a time capsule, where many streets are still lined by crumbling colonial facades and potted by holes that look like they've been there for decades. It's a reflection of the lack of investment in basic services and buildings, which have been left to ruin. Although still inhabited, they are owned by the government. Some renovation programs are underway, but it will take huge amounts of resources to complete. In the early 1960s, the United States placed an embargo against Cuba as a commercial, economic and financial response to Cuba's nationalization, without compensation, of American-owned Cuban oil refineries. The embargo on exports to Cuba, with the exception of food and medicine, was to be maintained so long as the Cuban government refused to move towards democratization and greater respect for human rights. In these conditions, life can be difficult, with historical building design preventing easy access to the upper floors, so ingenuity is required, i.e., it's a basket delivery of food. In the streets, hundreds of locals line up to eat the delicious Copelia ice cream, which is heavily subsidized by the government to keep the populace happy, but foreigners can jump the queue. The Plaza de la Revolucion is dominated by the Jose Marti Memorial, a 109-meter tall tower standing in front of the Palace of Revolution, the seat of the Cuban government. Millions of Cubans have been addressed from this square. An image of Che Guevara can be found on the facade of the Interior Ministry, while an image of Camilo Cienfuegos adorns the adjacent telecom building. The Colon Cemetery, which was named after Christopher Columbus, is the third most important cemetery in the world, based on its glorious architecture and history. It covers an area of 56 hectares and is the final resting place of approximately 2 million souls, including some of Cuba's most historically important figures. Visitors are attracted to the estimated 500 elaborately sculpted memorials, major mausoleums, chapels and family vaults, with the cemetery built in various architectural styles from classical to Art Deco, Romanesque, contemporary or eclectic. There are unique symbols such as inverted torches that remind us about the end of life, as well as branches of laurel and winged hourglass, marking the irreversible nature of earthly life. The cemetery is a reflection of the rundown state of the country, with many tombs abandoned and in various states of disrepair, since many families fled from the revolution. However, some exiled Cubans still send money home to maintain their family plot. There's an Italian marble structure built to honour the 25 firemen who died in Havana's Great Fire of 1890. It's incredibly detailed with exquisite low-relief design, including the face of each firefighter around its base. The Fuerzas Armadas Revolutionaries Monument, built in 1955, is a large pantheon that houses Cuban heroes of the Revolutionary Armed Forces. The Morro fortress is a symbol of Havana and one of the most visited places by both tourists and locals. It has fantastic views over the sea and the city. In Spanish, the word Morro means a rock which is visible from the sea. Built initially in 1589 in response to raids on Havana harbour, it has an irregular polygonal shape, 3-metre thick walls and a deep protective moat, and is a classic example of Renaissance military architecture. The Castillo's famous lighthouse was not a feature of the original fort, but a later addition in 1844. One of the more unusual features are the holes in the back walls through which prisoners were fed to the sharks. For more than a century the fort withstood numerous attacks, but in 1762, after a 44-day siege, a 14,000-strong British force captured El Morro by attacking from the landward side. The Maritime Museum includes a riveting account of the fort's siege, original battering rams, trebuchet and cannons. A small defensive turret and lookout point at the end of the wall offers views over the huge dry moat. There are many cannons around the fort, some of which are badly rusted, but on others you can still see the finely inscribed designs. The Cuban Revolution began with an ill-prepared armed attack on the Macada barracks by 122 rebels, led by a 26-year-old Fidel Castro on July 26, 1953. It was carnival time in Santiago de Cuba. The fighting only lasted 30 minutes, during which time 8 rebels and 19 of Batista's soldiers were killed. 60 rebels were also caught and tortured. Castro escaped, but was later caught and jailed. But the seeds of the revolution had been sown. The date of the attack, July the 26th, was adopted by Castro as the name of his revolutionary movement. Santa Clara was the site of the last battle of the Cuban Revolution, and the one that clinched it for Fidel Castro. General Batista's last attempt to retain power was ended by forces commanded by Ernesto Che Guevara, who derailed an armoured train carrying ammunition, heavy weapons and 300 soldiers from Havana. The revolutionaries achieved victory with Batista's flight from Cuba a mere 12 hours after the battle finished. Che Guevara was assassinated by the CIA-backed Bolivian army, but was buried with full military honours in 1997 in the mausoleum below the 22-foot bronze statue of him bearing his rifle. The mausoleum has a museum dedicated to Che Guevara's entire life and features an eternal flame lit by Fidel Castro in Che's memory. Within 2 years of taking power, he had declared the revolution to be a Marxist-Leninist in nature, and allied the island nation firmly to the Soviet Union. During Fidel's dictatorship, political opponents have been imprisoned, the independent media suppressed, and thousands of Cubans have fled into exile. Cienfuegos is known affectionately as the Pearl of the South. Established during the colonial era, it soon grew to be a powerful town due to the fertile lands and its railroad port, which was used by the Cuban sugar oligarchy. A rosette in the Jose Marti Park marks the place where the town was founded and which served as the centre for the urban design layout. The Palacio del Valle in Cienfuegos was constructed between 1913 and 1917 on land purchased by Don Acilio de Valle, and at a time it cost 1.5 million pesos. The marble sphinx either side of the front door gave an illusion of grandeur to which de Valle thought he should become accustomed. The owner's initials are crisscrossed into artistic monograms in the ceramic mosaic floor. The mansion combines the styles of Byzantine, Venetian, Gothic and Baroque. There are decorated carved wood cornices crowning the entrances to the halls, doorways, arches. fine stucco walls and a Carrara marble staircase. The building has Gothic-style arched windows and stained glass, high ceilings and spacious rooms, sliding ventilation and light to its many rooms. Acisclo only enjoyed the palace for 3 years. He died in 1920 and bequeathed the estate to his wife and 7 children. The building has a roof terrace which is reached via a metal spiral staircase. At the top there are great views over the bay. Shade is provided by pergolas and rooftop towers.